Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine, messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Just a shell, just a shell, just a shell until you decide to rebel. Whether you're white, black, your soul does not dwell inside your shell until you decide to rebel. Whirly, people allow your inner sides to intervene and circulate. Open your eyes, open your ears. Wouldn't it be great?
Habari gani? This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Saturday, December 30th, 2023. We commence today's program with our sister Luyanda Kuboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. This hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Mari Crabtree, Associate Professor of African American Studies at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, and author of the book My Soul is a Witness, The Traumatic Afterlife of Lynching. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Professors John Bardes and K. Stevens Prince, both teaching at Louisiana State University at Baton Rouge, and co-authors of the article in a recent edition in the Journal of African American History titled There Is No God, Black Religion Resistance in the Police Power, New Orleans. We also want to remind our listeners to mark your calendar for Saturday, February 3rd, 2024, from 1 to 3 p.m. Dr. Gerald Horne will be here in Los Angeles for a Black History Month conversation and book signing, hosted by Freedom Now and Dr. Melina Abdullah, host of KPFK's Move the Crowd. This event will be taking place in Africatown Leimert Park at 3423 West 43rd Place, 90008. Tickets are $25. You can purchase them online on the KPFK website. We look forward to seeing you there. Dr. Horne will be talking about his books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Arrested Development, Eric Reed, Conrad Herwig, Tito Puente, Miles Davis, Robin Eubanks, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Just to tell until you decide to rebel.
The American capitalist system, a backward system, has a way of presenting history as if history is made by one man, one great woman. And that this great man, this great woman comes along and directs the dumb masses who follow them for whatever reasons, and they light up the way to show the people how to go in the darkness. So Whenever you study, for example, the American Revolution, you say George Washington, that means you know everything. You say Abraham Lincoln. Even in recent years of the struggle here, you could say Martin Luther King. See? The attempt is to make it appear as if history is made indeed by these a great person. And usually our history is not made by us, but really made by one great person outside of our race, usually a great white man. Thus, in the Civil War, we did absolutely nothing. It was Abraham Lincoln. As a matter of fact, recently, some lot of garbage is written in books by people who call themselves historians, making it appear as if we have to thank Lyndon Baines Johnson for the advancement because he signed the Civil Rights Bill. Of course he signed it. But while he was signing it, we were in the streets burning the country down. You better hurry to sign it. Burn the whole country down. Do it quick. But if you're not careful, you will thank Lyndon Baines Johnson.
We have just heard Kwame Ture on history. This is Didan Kamathi with this week's edition of the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. This internationalist calendar brings to our attention the righteous struggles of the oppressed women, workers, peasants, and nationalities who have been preyed upon by the economic systems of exploitation. We give life by praising up our struggle for a human-centered world. December 29, 1835, the Seminole Indian leader Oxelia Mekanopa and jumpers were victorious in defeating the U.S. Army in a joint African and Native American strategy. The United States attacked the Seminoles of Florida for the principal stand in providing a refuge for runaway African slaves in the Seminole nations where they were given full human rights. December 30th, 1939, Lourdes Casal Valdez was born, a Cuban-American poet, scholar, and radical activist. At first, she was not supportive of the Cuban Revolution and left Cuba to live in the United States. However, the racism she observed in the U.S. and her travels in 1962 to Africa, as well as her direct involvement in the U.S. Black liberation struggle, changed her views of socialism. She returned to Cuba in 1973 and traveled often between Cuba and the United States, organizing the Antonia Macheo Brigade to support the Cuban Revolution. December 29, 1923, Cheikha Anta Diop, the Pharaoh of Knowledge, a Senegalese Egyptologist, historian, anthropologist, physicist, and politician, was born. Considered the greatest African historian of the 20th century due to his PhD thesis at the University of Paris that documented that the ancient Egyptians were black. His continued research documented that the earliest known human civilizations in North Africa were black, not European. December 29, 1911, Dr. Sun Yat-sen is named the first president of the Republic of China and considered the father of the nation. Dr. Sun Yat-sen played a major role in overthrowing the 2,000 year of imperial or feudal dynasties of China. He led successful revolutionary governments to unite China, challenging Chinese warlords who controlled much of the divided nation of China. He was a fervent Pan-Asianist. Dr. Sun Yat-sen states that the problem between the East and the Europe is a cultural contradiction, the rule of right versus the rule of might. The rule of right, Asian culture, respects benevolence, good deeds, and virtue, whereas the rule of might respects only force and violence. Hence, Pan-Asianism must be based on a cultural foundation of the historical culture of the rule of right. This has been the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar here at Freedom Now.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now, and with me on the line is Mari Crabtree, Associate Professor of African American Studies at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, and author of the book, My Soul is a Witness, The Traumatic Afterlife of Lynching. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Crabtree.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is such an honor to be speaking with you this morning.
and it's an honor to speak with you as well. So, why did you write this book, My Soul is a Witness?
So there's a number of ways in which I kind of came to this project. I wanted to write a book about lynching that focused on the Black South instead of on white lynchers and perpetrators. I wanted to write a book that was telling stories instead of looking at statistics. I wanted to be able to think about kind of the personal impacts of lynching on people, in particular, Black communities and families in the South. I also wanted to disrupt some of the more typical bookends that historians place on lynching. We often talk about lynching as occurring between around 1880 and 1940 or so in the South. And we often think about lynchings in terms of the beginning of the mob assembling and then ending when the mob disperses. And I think that as important as that periodization is, I wanted to think about lynching in terms of its long-term impacts. I wanted to think about it in terms of cultural memory. And so I kind of pushed the bookends in my book from 1940 into really up into the present in some ways. I also am really engaging with what I think is an important part of African American studies and African American history, which is the resistance paradigm. And while I understand why resistance is such an important part of thinking about the Black experience, especially in this country, I think that sometimes we miss other parts of the Black experience when we only look for resistance. There's a whole lot of living that happens that's not in reaction to what white people did, even when you're talking about something like lynching. There's Black interiority that I think needs to be recovered. And so by telling stories about lynching's afterlives within the Black community, I'm able to push back against the sort of limited ways in which we imagine Black life when we really only focus on resistance or suffering. And I think also, I wanted to make an argument about the ways in which we need to think about the traumatic afterlife of lynching in ways that are specific to the Black cultural tradition. There is a lot of wonderful work done on trauma studies, and a lot of that work is rooted in a European model for understanding how people deal with trauma. And the African American context is so different from a lot of these other places where trauma studies has been otherwise studied, especially if we look at Europe after the Holocaust, or we look at like South Africa after apartheid. And so I wanted to find a way to understand the afterlife of lynching in the US context among African Americans that was really responsive to those particularities. And so I used the sensibility of the blues as the way to get at that. And we can talk about that later in more depth, but those are the kind of major things that I was trying to do through the book.
Now, what about the dimensions of lynching, which you just alluded to, in terms of how many over what time frame? It's a gendered phenomenon, to my understanding, that is to say disproportionately Black men were subjected to lynching. But what of children, women, seniors? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I think that lynching in the US South in particular did tend to target Black men. It often targeted people who were very successful. It often targeted people who were seen as challenging, even in the slightest of ways, the dominance of Jim Crow and white supremacy. But it also included people who were at least accused of crimes. And often when the victims were women, and there were many, not nearly as many as Black men, but there were many Black women who were also lynched. But a lot of the time, those victims were often they were kind of by association with Black men that they were lynched. So I write about Mary Turner, whose husband was lynched, and because she spoke out against the lynching, this is in southern Georgia in 1918, she herself was captured and brutally lynched, as was, and she was pregnant at the time, so as was the child that she was carrying as well. So it's a phenomenon that does certainly tend to target Black men, often successful Black men, but it does entrap the smallest of children at times, and also women, people of kind of any imaginable walk of life could be lynched. And in terms of numbers, it's so hard to really pinpoint an actual number because we are relying on a very incomplete historical record. And also the definition of lynching was one that has been contested consistently throughout U.S. history. And so the numbers are really hard to pinpoint, but it certainly in terms of what has been recorded and what organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative and even earlier than that, Tuskegee and the NAACP, their numbers make it, they've tallied in the thousands. But I think that's a very conservative number if we're talking about numbers.
Now, you said that you had more to say about the role of the blues and the blues sensibility. Could you elaborate on that at this point?
Sure. So I think that what's so helpful about using the blues to understand trauma within the African American experience is that the blues is obviously rooted in Black experience. It's not coming from outside, right? It's created by African Americans. And it's a sensibility that understands that life can be difficult. Life can be full of suffering. Life can be a low down dirty shame, but there's a way in which you can find a way through. You can persevere and make even beauty out of the suffering, out of the pain. And it's not so much so that you escape it completely, but it's a way of making life livable. And that's what I found in recovering these stories about Black communities in the aftermath of lynchings. There really is no neat resolution to lynching. Like, you can't bring the dead back. You can't undo that level of harm to a whole community. But you can find a way to make life livable. And that's really what I see happening in the blues sensibility and more generally in the ways in which Black Southerners dealt with and moved through and beyond lynchings.
Now, a landmark in the history of lynching was a song oftentimes associated with Billie Holiday, speaking of strange fruit, although the lyrics are attributed to Abel Meeropol, who may be known to some in our audience as the communist who, along with his wife Anne, adopted the two children of the slain alleged atomic spies, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So, do you have anything else to add about strange fruit? And by the way, recently the Wall Street Journal did a story about a so-called lynching song that I was not familiar with. It's called Supper Time, penned by Irving Berlin, who may be familiar to some in our audience, sung by the late chanteuse Ethel Waters. I was so struck by this story that I went and looked at the lyrics, and I understand why it hasn't been associated with lynching, because the lyrics are very metaphorical, they're very elusive. You would have to know that that's what the lyricist intended. Perhaps he did not want to alienate the right-wing base of the United States, which is why he was so abstract. But in any case, anything to add with regard to music and lynching?
And I think actually what you were just saying about Supper Time is one of the reasons why I like the blues as both in terms of the music and the sensibility. It's kind of intentionally slippery. It gives you plausible deniability. So you can be singing this song that seems to be about one thing and it's really about something else. And the people in the know, they know what's actually, they know the subtext. They know what's actually being articulated, but it gives you some kind of plausible deniability. And I think with Strange Fruit, there it's not nearly as ambiguous, right? I mean, it's hard to mistake that this is a song about lynching. But it's interesting that the lyrics are written in a way that there is it's not actual fruit that they're talking about, right? Even though that seems to be that's like the central image in that song. And so I think that even though Strange Fruit is far more explicitly about lynching than something like Supper Time is, you do get it kind of exposes the ways in which blues music can be kind of expansive. It can be really opaque. It can be really it can like more than just wink at you. It can like say very clearly what it is that's being critiqued. And I think that expansiveness is part of also the expansiveness of Black expression in the afterlife of lynching, right? You see both the more cloaked version and you see the more kind of open critique of lynching as well.
So how does lynching manifest in novels and in sculpture?
Yeah, I think that there's this a really wonderful book by Caretha Mitchell about plays and lynching. And there's been some really wonderful work done on art exhibitions that were organized in 1935, one by the NAACP and the other one by like a part of the Communist Party in New York City. And both of those exhibits really encouraged artists, especially Black artists, to think about how do you protest lynching through art. And in my book, I talk specifically about this really beautiful sculpture by Richmond Barthé. That unfortunately, the sculpture itself was destroyed soon after in a shipping accident after it was made. But it's called The Mother, and it's a take on this image of Mary holding Jesus after he's died. And you see in this, if you look really closely at the photographs of this sculpture, you see the burns on his neck from a lynching rope. And so you know that there's this kind of evocation of Jesus and Mary. And you're also seeing how lynching victims are then being understood in the same conversation as Jesus and Mary, whether that means that this is a kind of sacrifice, whether this means that that the lynching victims are on the side of God, whereas the lynchers are certainly not. There's a lot of different kinds of meanings you can take from the associations between the cross and the lynching tree, which again James Cone has written really beautifully about in his own work. So I think that there's a lot of wonderful artwork that's been done that helps to not only protest against lynching, but also think about what Black mourning looks like as well. And so that I particularly like that sculpture because it is both a protest that's outwardly focused, but it's also embracing what Kevin Quashie would call quiet, within that kind of Black interiority, mourning and love, and not something that is an expression of outward outrage toward white people, but actually internal, thinking about love within the Black community as a force against the kind of white rapacity, but also love within the Black community as something that's just beautiful in and of itself. So I think that there's a lot of really wonderful work that gets at that kind of interiority while also protesting. There's also some art that's very graphic and is, making you kind of confront face to face the violence of lynching. And those in the 1930s in particular were very important because of the ways in which there was this kind of blanket denial of lynching. And I think in the present, we're seeing how similar kinds of debates over how much do you show, how much do you conceal, how much Black death do you actually show in order to protest it. I think those same kinds of conversations we're having now were also going on in the 1930s and earlier around lynching and art and protest.
Well, speaking of parallels, what parallels do you see between lynching of yesteryear and today's police terror?
I think it's really difficult to disentangle it too. One of the things that I think is so important about the debates in the early 1940s among anti-lynching organizations was the definition of lynching. And the NAACP was very committed to thinking about lynching as something that is evolving, something that's gone underground and is changing form. And other groups, in particular, the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching, which was really, it was white Southern women who were organizing that group. They didn't want to believe that lynching was evolving. They wanted it to be done. They wanted to have kind of ended it and not have to think about it anymore. Whereas the NAACP was thinking about how it was continuing to evolve. And I think what we see with police killings is part of that evolution. Police killings were happening earlier as well, right? They were happening in the 18th century, 19th century, early 20th century as well. But I think that's one of the ways in which lynching has evolved. I also think that there are some cases that look almost identical to lynchings of the past. You look at James Byrd in the 1990s in East Texas. The manner in which he died is almost indistinguishable from lynchings that happened 50 years, 60 years earlier. I also think about Ahmaud Arbery going for a jog and then having vigilantes hunt him down and kill him. It's hard, that actually fits the definition of lynching that the NAACP and those other organizations put together in 1940. So I think that we have both this kind of evolving form of violence, like police killings, but then we also have things that actually are almost identical or actually are identical to the kinds of things we saw in the past. We might not have like mass mobs the way that you used to see, but the actual form of the killing sometimes actually is the same as it was during what we understand to be the peak period. And I think I'll end this my response here by thinking about the work of Ashraf Rushdie, who argues for us to think more deeply about why we seek to end lynching through definitions, rather than thinking about how the end of lynching, while it's a good thing to have happen, often has been sort of defined out of existence. Often we've just defined it out of existence rather than actually ending the practice. And that is something that we need to grapple with. It's easier to say we've ended it than to actually think about how it's evolved.
What's remarkable about that point is that over recent decades, there has been a trend towards privatization and a shrinking of the public sector and having free market forces, individuals, non-state actors do the tasks that were assigned to the state. Now, with regard to lynching, you see that turned on its head. That is to say, a recrudescence of the public sector, police force, the state actor, stepping in as the non-state actors, Ahmaud Arbery and others aside, or pushed to the margins. I think we need some deeper thinking on that as well. And speaking of deeper thinking, what's next on your research agenda, Professor Crabtree?
So I'll just add one little thing from what you just said, which is that there's a really great book that came out a while, I think it was maybe in the 90s, that Charles Ogletree and Austin Serrett published about, I think it's called The Killing State, which is about the connection between lynching and the police state that we live in right now, like the use of the death penalty. And so there's been a little bit of work on that, but it hasn't been updated in the last 30 years. In terms of the work that I'm engaged in right now, I'm working on two projects. One is a book of essays that is about ethical praxis in Black studies in the age of neoliberalism. So you were speaking about privatization, and I worry about kind of what is happening within universities, especially to Black studies and Africana studies programs and departments. We are now parts of these institutions, and yet these institutions do not share the kind of liberatory values that these programs and departments where their roots are. And so I want to think about how do we ethically do Black studies within universities that are really about extraction, that are really about productivity, but not actually thinking about being responsive to actual Black people and actual Black communities. I'm also working on a project that is on guile and deception within the Black cultural tradition. And that'll be more like a monograph rather than essays. And I want to think about how there's both a real political utility to subversion. There's a way in which it protects you, and there's a way in which it can be really effective. But it also is something that provides a whole lot of pleasure too. And so what I want to explore is kind of the political utility and the pleasures of guile and deception and subversion and sabotage and those kinds of strategies within the Black cultural tradition, and then think about how those could actually be deployed to some extent out there in the real world.
You have at least one eager reader waiting to pounce on that book. Professor Crabtree, Associate Professor of African American Studies at College of Charleston in South Carolina, author of the book My Soul is a Witness, The Traumatic Afterlife of Lynching. Thank you for joining us on KPFK Pacifica Radio, Freedom Now.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line are John Bardes and K. Stephen Prince, both teaching at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, and co-authors of an article in a recent edition of the Journal of African American History entitled, There Is No God: Black Religion, Resistance, and the Police Power in Jim Crow New Orleans. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professors Bardes and Prince.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
So why did you all choose to write this article?
Well, so I was wrapping up my first book, which traces the evolution of police and prisons in New Orleans from the Louisiana Purchase in the early 1800s through to the rise of Jim Crow in the early 1900s. And while I was looking at the transformation of policing that coincided with the rise of Jim Crow for that book, I started encountering stories where Black men and women, while they were being arrested, started declaring that they were part of the Council of God, this religious movement, and that they would have their vengeance on the police. Obviously, that really grabbed my attention, and as I started probing into what this religious movement, the Council of God, what it was, I found an account of a police raid on a Council of God church, where the police uncovered a shrine honoring Black men and women who had either killed police officers or who had been killed by police officers in New Orleans, honoring these men and women as though they were saints. Obviously, that really grabbed my attention. That's a very bold and and dangerous thing to do in the context of the rise of Jim Crow. So we started I brought in my friend K. Stephen Prince, and we started probing the story of this Council of God religious movement, which swept New Orleans in about 1907 before it was violently exterminated by the police in that year. And what we found, what we came to see in this movement was it was a unique or an intriguing example where a religious movement was really shaped directly in response to the kinds of police violence that were growing in the Jim Crow South in this moment. And at the same time, the opposite was also true, that while police were shaping this religious movement, Black religious movements like the Council of God and others were directly shaping the rise of Jim Crow policing and the sorts of violent tactics that police officers were deploying.
So, Professor Prince, before I ask you about Robert Charles, who's mentioned on page 235 of the article, and of course, he was a subject not only of a recent interview with you about him, about your book on KPFK, but you mentioned him here. But do you have anything to add with regard to the Council of God before we turn to Robert Charles?
Well, sure. So, John invited me to I think actually got in touch with me largely because of the reference to Robert Charles. Included in this shrine to African Americans who had been involved in violent altercations with the police was a sort of a sort of shrine to Robert Charles in a sense. It was an old newspaper that was encased in some protective sort of casing and clearly had been an object of reverence. So the Robert Charles story sort of came in, and I think John invited me to work with him for that reason. But then we got to sort of unpacking the doctrine, the ideology of the Council of God itself, which was endlessly fascinating. And I mean, in brief, members of the Council of God were sort of adherents to Black Israelitism. So the notion that African Americans were the descendants of biblical Hebrews. This is a movement that is born sort of simultaneously in several places in the late 19th century, and of course expands in a variety of ways into the 20th. But in terms of the Council of God, they also believed in resurrection and reincarnation. So they believed that the Council of God elders were the direct embodiments of Old and New Testament biblical figures. A variety of other sort of fascinating beliefs, but the most significant one was probably the belief that there was no, as the title of the article suggests, there is no God in heaven. They did not believe in heaven or hell in a sort of traditional Judeo-Christian sense, but instead believed that African Americans were literally living in hell. And so they explained the violence of Jim Crow, the violent legacies of slavery, with reference to a belief that African Americans were being punished for having killed Jesus. And so the daily life of African Americans in the Jim Crow South was sort of refigured as hell, right? This is not a metaphor. This is quite literal, that daily life for Black people in the Jim Crow South was hell. And that explains the sort of violence that these people were living with on a daily basis. But of course, there's also the flip side of that, the sort of promise that it would not always be this way, and the notion that someday, at some points, order would be restored, and African Americans would sort of come to take their rightful place at the head of society, as opposed to being punished within it. So it's a fascinating sort of set of doctrines, especially when you sort of overlay them on the violence of late 19th, early 20th century Jim Crow New Orleans. So it was just a fascinating story to sort of try to unpack all of these threads that shapes Council of God belief and doctrine, and particularly the ways that those laced with the idea of violence on the part of the police and violence against the police.
Perhaps before we turn to your writing partner, give us a capsule summary of Robert Charles, which will indicate why there was a shrine to him that was constructed in New Orleans.
Of course. So Robert Charles was an African-American man who, in the summer of 1900, got into an altercation with several white police officers in the uptown part of New Orleans. He ends up killing 2 white police officers before going into hiding for the better part of a week, at which point white residents of the city take to the streets and start killing African-Americans in the streets, ostensibly searching for Robert Charles, but really seeking sort of vengeance and laying claim to the public space of the city. At the end of this week of violence, Robert Charles was located. He ended up killing 2 more white police officers and several members of a large crowd that gathered before he, Charles, was finally killed himself. So I wrote about this event in my, 2021 book, The Ballad of Robert Charles, Searching for the New Orleans Riot of 1900. And we had a conversation about that several years ago, I believe. So Robert Charles is one of the things that I argued in the book is that this story was quite consciously suppressed across most of the 20th century in New Orleans, but it is kept alive in certain circles within the African-American community. But still, it is a story of forgetting and of silence, and of a story that is particularly powerful and is suppressed for that reason. So it was particularly striking for John to get in touch with me and say, hey, did you know about this organization, the Council of God, who apparently was still sort of revering Robert Charles 7 years after his death? I'm embarrassed to say that I did not. I did not find mention of the Council of God in writing the book. I wish I had. So the Council of God appears nowhere in my book on Robert Charles, in spite of the fact that I do have some discussion of later African-American groups who did keep his story alive. But what I actually wanted to say is, if the story of Robert Charles is sort of tamped down and silenced, the story of the Council of God, I think, is almost entirely erased. I think this is something that is not, other than a couple sort of moments, it is sort of brutally suppressed. And by comparison, the Robert Charles story is something that is quite legible in the city's sort of memorial landscape. But the Council of God is completely sort of eradicated and suppressed in the early 20th century, which is a fascinating comparison.
Completely eradicated indeed, Professor Bardes. And to that end, on page 224, there's a headline from a New Orleans newspaper in 1907, quote, would enslave whites, unquote, speaking of the Council of God. Then on page 233, you too write, that the Council of God stood poised to overthrow the white gods and take place in heaven on earth. And then on page 238, you write that the killing or the attack on, I believe was the New Orleans police officer, was, quote, the first strike in a premeditated religious war on the white race, unquote. Could you elaborate on that? And were these claims, such as enslaving the whites, for example, taken seriously?
Right. So it's an absolutely fascinating story, the way that police became aware of the Council of God and the sheer panic that erupted within white New Orleans after they became aware of it. So the way that this all went down, the Council of God had about 3 or 4 churches in the city of New Orleans by 1907 and several dozen members. Police learned of this movement quite by accident, where a police officer entered a temple where a religious ceremony was being held. The police officer panicked, fired his gun at one of the congregants. The gun misfired, and the congregants in response seized the police officer, and one of the Council of God members actually slit his throat with a knife. And there was a massive police raid on the church. Several people were shot, several people were killed. There were threats and attempts to lynch all of the congregants who were inside this church. It was this really horrific, dramatic, traumatic event for the people of New Orleans at this moment. in the aftermath of that, police and newspaper reporters began interviewing Council of God members and writing down their theology. And police took from this theology or mutilated their theology into and started claiming that the Council of God had planned this police assassination and was preparing to launch an all-out religious war on white Christianity. Now, none of that was true. You know, that was simply white hyperbolic panic that was used to legitimate police violence that was then committed on the Council of God in the aftermath of this event. But it contained a kernel of truth in the idea that the Council of God's religious theology did hold that Black resistance to white police violence was some sort of religious duty or religious tenet. But then, by claiming that the Council of God was simply the opening salvo in an all-out Black on white religious war, the police department was able to use that exaggerated, nonsensical claim to legitimate horrific reprisals. So all of the Council of God churches and temples in the city were raided and shut down. Dozens of people were arrested. Several people were killed, and then ultimately 2 church members were hanged for the death of this police officer. And the Council of God simply became an outlaw religion in the city of New Orleans.
So we're speaking to Professors Bardes and Prince about their article in a recent edition of the Journal of African American History. And on page 229, you two gentlemen write about Noble Drew Ali and his Moorish Science Temple. You also make reference to the Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles, which, as I understand it, arises in Los Angeles at the same time as the Council of God in New Orleans. And you write, quote, you write that these formations, quote, arose from the fertile ground of Jim Crow era Black religiosity, unquote. How so? And perhaps could you digress with regard to what was the Azusa Street Revival?
Yeah, so I think this moment in African American history is recognized as a moment of great fertility in terms of a variety of religious movements, and you mentioned several that we do address in passing in the article. And I think one of the interesting notions here is that more often than not, I would say, African American religion is imagined as the sort of the ultimate form of cultural resistance to regimes of enslavement and segregation during the era of Jim Crow. But more often than not, I think it's imagined as a sort of a separatist impulse, a sort of site of community formation, sort of distinct from white oppression. And I think what really separates the Council of God from many of these other sort of orders and movements that spring up in the late 19th and into the early 20th century is the extent to which the Council of God directly addressed the oppression of Jim Crow as part of its sort of theological bedrock. I mean, it is the Council of God grew up in this Jim Crow moment. Its foundational tenets directly reflect the experience of African Americans living in the Jim Crow South. Of course, that separates it from Azusa Street in California and from Noble Drew Ali, in that it occurs in the Jim Crow South. And so the politics of Jim Crow, the race politics, the violence of this order is directly, as I said, sort of built into the very foundation of the Council of God's religious ideology. And there's a very interesting question that I think John alluded to, which is how how literally do we take the sort of notion that the Council of God aimed to overthrow white rule in the Jim Crow South and to reconfigure the earthly realm in a way that aligned with their vision of the afterlife and the just life? And it's, clearly the police did exaggerate for their purposes, but as John said, there is that council of truth, that there is a notion that the divine order is being perverted in the Jim Crow South, and that it was incumbent upon the member of the Council of God to do something about that, and to, if violence against the police was the means to achieve the millennium that they prophesied, then so be it, right? So to go back to the question, I mean, it is this moment of remarkable religious creativity around the United States in African American communities. And I'm not going to say that what we discovered here is completely unique, but I think the sort of the Jim Crow New Orleans background lends a particularly violent and a particularly political bent to the theology of the Council of God that I think makes this organization stand out in interesting and important ways from some of these other religious orders that grew up at around the same time.
So perhaps, Professor Bardes, you could elaborate on what is written on page 232 in the sense that the Council of God apparently saw a parallel between heaven and hell on the one hand and white privilege and black oppression on the other hand.
Yeah, so the Council of God preached that, as Steve said, that Black Americans in the Jim Crow South and in antebellum chattel slavery were literally experiencing hell. That hell was not a plane that existed somewhere else, but it was literally the experience of Black people in the Americas on Earth, and that white people, by contrast, were experiencing heaven. They also believed that the gods that were the god or gods that were giving power to white people were a malicious class of deities who only served the interests of white Americans and who took some sort of glee in torturing Black Americans. Meaning that, insofar as any gods existed in this religious worldview, they were malicious gods. Who were, as one of the religious leaders of the Council of God said, those gods are no friends to us. But again, they thought that at some point there would be a revolution, and that order would be reoriented, and a new class of gods who served the interests of Black Americans would take power, and white Americans would enter the hell that Black Americans had suffered for hundreds of years. And again, in the context of the emergent Jim Crow regime, this was a tremendously explosive set of religious beliefs to preach. And as the Council of God demonstrates, an incredibly dangerous theology to preach.
Dangerous indeed. So finally, Professor Prince, you get the last word. I take it that the Council of God was bludgeoned into submission. Perhaps you could elaborate upon that. And also tell us, since you're in Louisiana, if there are any echoes in 2023 of the Council of God today.
Wow, that's a great question. I'll take the first part first, and we'll see if we come to an answer to the echoes by the end of when I'm speaking here. So yes, I mean the New Orleans Police Department comes down with all of its might on the Council of God in the aftermath of the shooting in October of 1907. 2 members of the order are hanged. The temples across the city were closed. Congregants are sort of scattered to the wind. So at least for the moment, the New Orleans Police Department believed that they had sort of ended the threat of the Council of God. And oh, by the way, the New Orleans Police Department managed to successfully argue for 2 years of significantly increased funding in the aftermath of the Council of God uprising, which was something that the NOPD had been asking for several years and had been denied, but they do sort of achieve a nice bump from the city council in the aftermath of this incident. But so, you know, the Council of God was largely sort of scattered to the wind, as I suggested, but you do hear these resonances and these echoes. So we located elders and significant members in the Council of God who do appear in the years after the 1907 uprising in several altercations with the New Orleans Police Department. So in several cases, they are claiming to be sort of leading a revival of the Council of God. In other cases, they are still sort of traveling in a group of believers. In one case, they get involved in an altercation with some storekeepers, and then the police are called. So the sort of the main players in the Council of God organization, or at least several of them, don't actually leave the city and do on some level seem to continue their sort of posture of aggression towards the New Orleans Police Department. And then perhaps more interestingly, you have several African Americans in the years that followed the 1907 uprising who don't seem to have anything to have had anything to do with the original Council of God, but who use the story of the Council of God in the midst of their own altercations with the white police officers to sort of make a claim on unjust policing and to call for an uprising against the police power, the white police power of the New Orleans Police Department. So it does live on in sort of little pops and echoes for a decade or two after the 1907 events. And we did finally find one woman who, in interviews with interviewers from the Works Progress Administration in 1941, actually did recall the Council of God some 3 decades after the fact. So it does live on in echoes across the city for several decades. And in terms of this question of echoes, to my knowledge, there are no active Council of God temples in Louisiana today. But clearly the larger sort of question of white policing, of violence against African Americans, needless to say, that is a live question. That is something that lives on. That's something I addressed in my work on Robert Charles, and that's something that figures here. These earlier examples of white violence against African Americans and African American armed self-defense against the violence of the police power. Needless to say, that is a story that lives on to this day in the United States. So the Council of God itself may be gone, but that larger story, I think, is devastatingly relevant, and it's something that deserves to be remembered and kept alive.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Speaking to Professors Bardes and Prince of LSU Baton Rouge, co-authors of an article in the recent issue of the Journal of African American History entitled, "There Is No God: Black Religion, Resistance, and the Police Power in Jim Crow New Orleans." Thank you for joining us on Pacifica Radio, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was our treat.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests. Thank you, Dr. Mari Crabtree. Thank you, Professors John Bardes and K. Stephen Prince. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. This program, as well as prior programs, can be reheard for the next 60 days. Go to kpfk.org, audio archives, scroll to Freedom Now. Stay tuned for our sister Sumta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.